If we walk away with one thing, if I wanted anyone to learn anything, it would be, first put yourself beyond the possibility of defeat and then look for opportunities to defeat the enemy. You lose because of you. You win because of what they don't do right. And I think what happens is in progressive strategy typically is we're right. This is sort of like we're bringing the good news and we go forward and really don't reflect that there's an active opposition who is going to try to subvert what we do.
Welcome back to the Campaign Strategist, where we dig into the art and science of advocacy and campaigns. If you like what we're doing, please like and subscribe and share with others so we can keep doing more of it. Today, my guest is Eric Hensal, author of A Progressive Art of War, which applies Sun Tzu's ancient military strategies to modern political and social activism. Eric is a veteran progressive communications, political, and policy strategist with over 20 years' experience working with nonprofits, state and local governments, and political candidates. I really enjoyed the book, both because it's been ages since I read the original, and because Eric breaks down lessons of strategy that have endured for thousands of years into practical modern advice. It's a quick read, but it is thought-stimulating, and it kept giving me fresh perspectives on current challenges that I've been thinking a lot about. So Eric, thank you so much for joining me, and welcome to the Campaign Strategist.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
I wanted to start off with your story. What led you to the intersection of progressive politics and strategic theory?
For this, I have to go all the way back to when I was in high school. It was one of these things I came across this book kind of by accident. Back in the day that the first incarnation of Shogun was a big deal on television and all these books were coming out, and James Clavell came out with his edition of The Art of War. And I remember looking through my mother's Book of the Month Club thing, and I thought, that looks interesting. So it's really the first book I ever picked up a pencil and wrote notes in to try to figure out. And I did that when, I was 16. So I've been staring at this book for over 4 decades. I'm trying to think about it. But it's meant a lot to me over time because I think it's one out of my many experiences that's really helped shape how I view social change. And it's really given me a window into how to do things that I think a lot of folks in the progressive community don't get. We're more like firefighters most of the time. Like I'm out of the labor movement. It's just like, oh crap, what's happening now? I'm going to go run off and take care of it. And you don't really get to think about strategy. Meanwhile, the folks who put Project 2025 together, they spent decades planning it out very carefully and rolling it out. Hats off to them for planning that we don't necessarily do. So that was really the start of it. And it's just as I went, I had a natural progressive bent. Early on, I made gigs with service employees, did work with Teamsters for Democratic Union. That was fun. I wound up in the Painters Union for a while, long time actually. Just doing politics and labor, how to make that work. I always kept coming back to this. This was always something that was very formative, my approach.
It's amazing how relevant the insights still are today. If you were to give somebody the short version, what's the book about?
It's funny. It's kind of, on one hand, it's a difficult question because it is a deceptively simple book. It's really when you read it relative to your experience in the progressive community, you go, oh, yeah, that's what's important. Because I think that if we walk away with one thing, if I wanted anyone to learn anything, it would be, first put yourself beyond the possibility of defeat and then look for opportunities to defeat the enemy. You lose because of you. You win because of what they don't do right. And I think what happens is in progressive strategy typically is we're right. This is sort of like we're bringing the good news and we go forward and really don't reflect that there's an active opposition who is going to try to subvert what we do. Before you act, you really have to think it's okay, how is this going to come back at me if I don't do it right? And then make yourself secure and then wait for that chance to capitalize. I think that's probably the most important thing. And I think sometimes I liken it to, I think it's the 13th rule of golf. I forget which one, where you can't improve a ball's lie. You have to play it where it lies. I think a lot of times, in the progressive universe, it's like people think you can pick up the ball and move it. You can't. If you're underneath that tree and you got something in your way and you got to hit it. And you just have to get it out into the fairway. It might not be pretty. It might not be what you want to do, but you have to do it. And I think that's a lot of what this book says. It's very much consider who your opponent is. Consider where you are. Because it's discussions of heaven and earth. things that are changing around you and things that are the same. So we have a fairly consistent government structure, but elected folks change. Economics change, but we're fundamentally capitalist. But we always come at these things just like one-dimensionally, like this is correct. And I think we miss a lot because I think progressives don't like to think of, let's put it this way. Sun Tzu says all warfare is based on deception. Now people could read that and go, I don't lie.
Yeah.
And that's not really the point. The point is you don't have to let your opponents know what you're doing, right? You don't have to telegraph it. You just start doing things. So the deception is not really like I am lying to you. I'm just not fully informing you. It's like social change is not chess. Nobody has, a perfect picture of what the opponents are doing. It's more like chess and you can't see like 2/3 of the pieces in any given moment. And that's what I feel like we have to get back to. It's a quick example, I think, of so much of what trying to get at in this book is, I'm going to say this saying I agree with it, but, abolish ICE. And just back in like Trump's first go around. And I think, people don't get abolish. It sounds like chaos. It sounds like you just want, I always said, we should say melt ICE. We have to melt it. And melting is change. Melting is making something more hospitable. It allows you to talk about all sorts of things, but it doesn't get into the jackpot of like advocating chaos. And I think that's one of the things that happens to us is like, we have to do this. And it's just no real thought is given to how the uninitiated person's going to take it.
Yeah.
And I really think that's what part of the book gets to. It's like you have to know your opponents and you have to know the ground. You have to assume that somebody is actively opposing you. And then how do you make sure that doesn't get in your way?
Yeah. To me, that example in Defund the Police struck me as examples of a particular slice of the progressive community is essentially talking to itself and not thinking about how that is going to sound to others. You covered so much ground. I had lots of questions about all those pieces, but let's start at that fundamental of situating yourself in a defensible, unassailable position so that you're secure, you're safe, and then you can wait for the opponents to give you opportunities to go out and weaken, divide, push them back. What's an example of what that looks like in progressive politics? Started thinking about the healthcare bill, which we eventually prevailed, but it was one hell of a struggle. But maybe that's not a good example. So I'm asking you, what's a good example of sort of what that looks like, well practiced?
I mean, I think the ICE was good. I mean, I would think that it's kind of hard to give a specific example, mostly because what I always try to tell people is maybe another way to look at it is like, I want to do X, I believe X, I want to say X. Somehow you have to think like, what would Aunt Mabel say when you do that? And what would somebody...
Test. Yeah.
And then what would somebody who was trying to, persuade Aunt Mabel to, do the other thing, what would someone say? You have to sort of consider how you move forward. And that's what I always think is sorely lacking. I do have a pet cause at the moment, which is we all know that, the way like Bernie Sanders talks, for instance, is very popular on one hand. But on the other hand, the country's got such a tripwire to class politics, right? There's so much of a built-in ability to jackpot you on that. Our country's spent, 100 plus years, going after socialists, right? I mean, the beginning of this last century, when the American socialists opposed World War I, the American government denied them use of the mail, right? I mean, they really hammered them. So it's hard. I think the language we need to talk about is a language of privilege. The book has got a good quote I like from Tom Johnson, who was mayor of Cleveland 100 some odd years ago. Because I think it gets to that notion of fairness without sort of getting into sort of the weeds of like, okay, you're gonna take all my stuff or you're gonna collectivize my whatever. I mean, no, it's just that law should treat everyone the same. Somebody should not have access to things simply because of who they are or how much money they have. I mean, one of the problems with progressive argument is it is based in the language of weakness. Like, we have to help, minorities. We have to do this. You're oppressed minority. You're oppressed LGBTQ plus. Nobody really likes to think of themselves as oppressed in some level. No one likes to think of themselves as poor. What was it? Like, I think it was Steinbeck who said there's no poor people in America. There's only temporarily embarrassed millionaires. We tend to talk about things in terms of what you don't have, what you're lacking. And as opposed to just saying, that guy has his benefits from it. And that's the power of what Trump would talk about, a rigged system, because that makes sense to people. I want to work hard. I want to make a living. I know I can do these things. And somehow there is these roadblocks that I don't necessarily even fully understand. When you go after privilege, and I might have to torture you with the whole quote from Johnson at some point, but when you say that, it
Well, it's in the
talks
book.
all these things without getting into that kind of class conversation. So that's what's important.
One way of thinking about that, just to pry out this contrast, is rather than saying, oh, we need to address the needs of this particular group and that particular group, it's more like painting a picture for what it should be for everybody. Everybody should have access to healthcare. Everybody should have the ability to have a job that meets your economic needs and enables you to raise your family in a nice neighborhood in safety and with the stuff that you need, and to be able to get ahead in life. Like putting things in a way that a much broader set of people can actually see themselves in that picture, as opposed to narrowly defining the particular sets, which you want to write policy that way, because there are groups that are held back by structural things that should be addressed. But selling it, pitching it that way broadly creates some traps that I think we're currently experiencing. We're currently experiencing tremendous amount of backlash over what I think the right would say catering to, or unfairly trying to advantage particular groups, when from our perspective, we're just trying to make it fair for everybody. It does have a lot to do with the language and the initial frames that we set up.
The way I try to explain to people is like, look, almost everyone, works for the man, right? Almost everyone gets a paycheck. I mean, even upper middle class are like 2 paychecks away from really getting screwed over. If you want to find the thing that can unify more people than anything, it's like whoever gets a paycheck is there. And I don't care where you are in the economic spectrum, because you make money, you obligate yourself more, and you oftentimes wind up in the same kind of predicament. And, so I think the failing has been, we've been trying to build, like with Legos, a coalition of like, okay, we can get these people if we do this, we can get these people if we do that. And we try to hope to sort of build up the coalition that way. And again, it's important to understand the perspectives of people and where they're coming from. But I think, it's become almost too surgical. It's like, we're going to find this, we're going to find that. Then people say things like, well, yeah, the voters of color are going to like really come out. And, and then the whole food progressives do weird things and vote for green parties and stuff. Because I think it's done. I wrote once, which I always kind of liked, was these people expect, voters of color to do cleanup on aisle 5, and, their votes will fix Trump. And that's not true. But, but I do think the other thing is, it's like we talk about diversity, but no one ever talks about why it's important. It's just like some sort of fuzzy thing. And I always tell people, it's like, look, what are the strongest metals? You have a pure sort of iron, there's no carbon in it, well, that sucks. You have steel and you put some lithium in it or whatever, you mix it all up, you get a much better, more resilient metal. Conversely, it's like, who are the healthiest dogs? Mutts. Really, when you get right down to it, they've got a diverse everything. They're just dogs, and they're put together in a way that makes sense for a dog, as opposed to trying to be a specific breed of dog, which, is really a problem. So, diversity is important because it's resilience, and it's a greater ability to innovate, and it's a greater ability to sort of resist adversity. And we never mention it like that. I mean, I think, I can't remember her name. It was a woman who was a sociologist who she was head of the American Sociological Association at one point, but she did research on the impact of diversity training and management. And, basically the way it was portrayed actually made managers less likely to make diverse hires, because they were afraid of making mistakes, because the whole thing was, if you do this, you do that. If you do this, you do that. And they're like, oh crap, I don't want to do that. So it actually made them more gun shy. But if you said, look, if you have a team with a variety of experiences, you can find solutions to problems you might not have thought about, because somebody's just coming in from a whole different place. So, I do think we have to sort of think about how we talk about diversity, because I think a diversity that benefits everybody is a more, I wouldn't say saleable, but it's ability to connect. Because it's not just like giving somebody some favor. Yeah. It's like, look, this is all good for all of us. And you can make the argument, it's like, how did we pull out of World War II? I think a lot of that was just a sort of a diversity of people who made it easier, quicker to find solutions to certain problems as you went on to, like, make more tanks or whatever. It's like, oh yeah, I remember, we could do that. If everyone's from the same place in the same time, I think that's like my one sort of criticism of the Obama administration. It was like so Ivy heavy that I don't think they had, like, they didn't more people from Kent State University or something, someplace out there, because they just sort of had this one very specific worldview, and it was difficult for them to shake it.
I definitely have heard, people make the case that, look, diversity makes us stronger. But right now, there's a tremendous amount of scapegoating of that. And that ties for me into a lot of the deception that the right employs. You also emphasize this heavily in the book and in your opening statement, talking about deception in various forms. And the right is much more comfortable than the left is. And that in certain ways, the left needs to get better at using it so we don't just give away our plans to the other side, but without sort of lying to the public. So talk about why deception is so important from Sun Tzu's perspective in this context, and how do we thread that needle?
It's a difficult thing to sort of get across. The word is deception in the text. It is deception, but it really is just not telegraphing what you're going to do, and give somebody, heads up, like, oh, this is where you're coming from. It's just sort of let things happen. I've been thinking about this too, so it kind of fits, but I was thinking about promoting girls in STEM in school, right? Definitely need to be done. There's all sorts of things that had to be done. But, for instance, you have problems in classroom management where boys pay more attention to boys and girls. You can, or curriculum problems. There's no women in the curriculum for science. There's problems of just not encouraging girls. All of these things are important and necessary. But I think what somehow we did, there was a performative aspect to it that didn't have to be there. It's like you could take care of classroom management curriculum without sort of casting boys as villains sometimes, because I know, my kid grew up through that, and it's not the only cause in the world, but I think sometimes we get hung up because we have to look good as opposed to just doing something. You throw all this stuff out there for red meat for people to go after, as opposed to just hey, we know this is a problem, let's fix it and move on. So I would say the problem is not so much deception, but sometimes we are more performative. We want to show certain things.
Yeah, virtue
and be out front in a certain way that, again, we're lacking the awareness of what people are going to do with that come after us. So, deception's in the book, but it's really more of who needs to know what when and how much do you put out. I think related to this is sometimes deception can also be, I think this is also an important thing in Sun Tzu, is make sure your enemy can't join their armies together. Make sure that they can't ally against you and figure these things out. That's deceptive in its own way that also progressives don't really like. Monkey wrenching. And I'm a big fan of monkey wrenching. Because I think in Sun Tzu, he said, we will never know who the greatest general is because the greatest general wins without having to fight. Stuff just gets done. That's what I really appreciated about Biden. He got all this stuff done, and at some point, how did he do it? In some ways, that's a classic Sun Tzu sort of general. It's he did it. And I think all these, Democrats and panicking, put us in a real bind because, everyone said, well, she could run. I'm like, she's still vice president. Nobody really knows who vice president is. And it's horrible. People didn't understand. They didn't see sort of the Obama smoothness. And they really weren't thinking, well, he's got this stuff done. What's the problem?
That was something the Biden administration was really frustrated by. And I think a lot of progressives were he's made all of these things happen, which have clear benefits. And it is so hard to get people to hear that, to recognize that the bridges in your community are being rebuilt because Biden shepherded through the bipartisan infrastructure law, or that you've got solar manufacturing or battery manufacturing now actively invested in and employing people in your state. And that's because of the Inflation Reduction Act. That's one of the, I think, heaven conditions that I was thinking about as I read the book, is that I feel like we're really slow in adapting to is this media environment, which is full of deception and also incredibly constantly distracting. I think it's actually the most important challenge the progressive movement has to figure out. How do we deal with? We're very far behind in generating the content, the noise, that level of reach. We've got to figure out how to get in there and be able to reach regular people. And part of it, of course, is message, but also the sheer volume of what the right is able to put out there that we have yet to be able to compete with.
It was funny, though. I got to the chapter of attack by fire, and I'm like, well, how can I do this? And then I'm looking at it, and I'm like, well, it's a lot like social media. There's certain things that you do in a campaign that just goes out there, and you don't quite know how it's going to go. So, so all that discussion about how to attack by fire actually became much more relevant if you look at it from that lens. But sort of going back to deception for a second, because I do think the one thing progressives have a hard time with that Republicans are, they're good at. They'll be happy to go into some urban area and shave a couple of points, right? because they understand that, they got to get up to 50. And so they'll do some things and they don't want to win, but they know they need enough. And we don't do that because we think that's deceptive. I think we have, it's criminal how little attention the Democrats have really paid to rural voters. I mean, there is poverty out there. There is much less economic opportunity. I mean, you got some of these rural areas that have the biggest employer is the hospital, or maybe one meatpacking plant and a Walmart that, killed off the downtown. And just all sorts of these things that are really grinding folks in rural areas. And we don't talk about it at all. I know, everybody knows you're not going to win all these counties. But if you actually honestly talk to people there, if you got 5 points, I mean, just look at every election night. I'm from Ohio, so I pay attention to Ohio a bit more because I know my way around. 88 counties, and and you can run up good totals in Cuyahoga County in Cleveland, or Summit County around Akron. You can run up good, but then it's 60 tiny little counties that just keep adding 1,000 votes, 1,000, and next thing you know, you lost the state because of all these little counties and all these middle of nowhere places. It adds up, and I think we've just sort of passed up that because we don't think of, well, they're not going to vote for us. We have to get minority votes, which is true, especially in Ohio, because minority turnout in Cleveland has been dropping and dropping and dropping since Obama years. But you got 60 some odd rural counties in Ohio that you need to pay some attention to sort of help support your totals in the state.
What that brings to mind for me is you also discuss pay attention to what your enemy is doing at the margins, because that can clue you into their strategy, which got me thinking about Trump invested in Spanish language radio in Miami and in other markets. I think a lot of people thought he's an idiot. Why waste the time and money? It had an impact. It shaved, in the last election, a more considerable margin. They had programs aimed at parts of the Democratic coalition, which, really shaved things down. And you look at any one of them as that's not that big an operation. And it didn't have to be. Going from that and realizing you put the whole thing together, and it was really impactful. And another one of the things that you talk about is basically not listening to what's going on, even just beyond your opponent. There are several times in the book I went, holy crap. Yeah, I've been doing that. I mean, for a long time, I'd read about the disaffection with this or that from what has become part of the right coalition. I was like, well, you know what they're talking about, or they're dumb, or my gosh, they should read the New York Times and then things will be straightened out, right? I think that probably a lot of people had that reaction. And over time, this thing kind of snuck up on us to where, especially twice, Trump prevailing was a huge shock. I mean, certainly a big shock the first time, and an even greater shock the second time, because we were like, what? Didn't you get enough of a sense of what this was about the first time? The other thread that you talk about is don't impute stupidity or misunderstanding to your opponent. And that's a mistake I feel like we make a lot of the time, where Trump or MAGA does things that are incomprehensible to us. And we just, sometimes, look, frankly, with Trump, it's hard to tell, is he stupid or has he got an actual game plan here? I think we should be expecting that there's actually a game plan that we don't understand because we're not tuned in. He is willing to sound stupid to some people because he knows he can reach a particular group or audience, or he's pressing a button that's really important. And I think we're still failing to really grasp that. And instead of just going, well, that's dumb. In a way, I think the right has a point. We sort of have been in an elite leftist bubble and not actually in touch. I think that's fair in some ways. I think it's part of why we are where we are, because we haven't been paying attention to a significant number of people in the country. There's also a lot of deception involved, which doesn't help and certainly makes things worse.
Considering the rural voters here for a second, I think you should question every assumption that you have. You've got to sort of turn everything over, look at it from all sides. Your biases will kill you. And, so when you look at the rural voters, you're like, oh, they like their guns or this and they're just whatever. They go to, okay, so what? They like their guns. Okay, fine. That's not necessarily a bar to dealing with folks. They just are really into their guns, right? I grew up, my dad got his high school letter in marksmanship. My grandfather was college rifle team, and he was hired by Firestone to be a ringer on his team. So I have a whole tradition of people who shot things. I didn't really take that up, but I'm still progressive, right? I was the kid, I was 8 years old, collecting signatures to stop clubbing of baby seals in Canada, which, my dad was kind of appalled by it. We go into situations, we just kind of assume things. And if you assume something, your assumptions prevent you from trying to find common ground with somebody and try to sort of say, this is what we would do if we were elected for a rural community, you're leaving a bunch of stuff on the table that you're wasting. And I think one of the things about Sun Tzu is like, it was just oddly interesting to me, the older I get, is this whole conversation about resources. It's expensive to move an army around. It's going to drive up cost, wherever you're invading. I mean, it was all sorts of these conversations about this. So I think this is also a matter of just sort of thinking about how you allocate resources to these things. And in some ways, people think, well, why would we spend any money on rural communities? Because they're not going to vote for us. It's like, that's not the point. You got enough people to vote for you, then it's very much worth the while. As opposed to things like thinking Beto was going to run and win in Texas for anything. People are like giving him money, he raised a lot of money. And, but I'm looking at the polls, I'm like, Trump is like 20 points ahead. And so, I mean, it's like, I don't care what some weird head-to-head thing is. It's like the whole like zeitgeist in Texas was not looking promising. And I don't know how people are coming up with this notion that he could possibly win. And I still just think of all that money that could have gone somewhere else, even to state and local races, which is the other sort of progressive weakness. Everyone likes Congress because, no one wants to be township trustee. And that's what the right was good at. They got their people elected township trustee, right? I mean, the right would pick people that they liked and sort of develop them. So they would give them a decent job somewhere, and then they could go off and be a township trustee, and then a county council member, and then a state rep, whatever. And they would work their way up the food chain. Because I'll tell you, you go to ask somebody, even somebody who's like, I don't like politicians or whatever, I'm running for city council. I'll be like, well, what have you done? People still go back to that. What they were good at is they developed people who had that experience and, quite frankly, skill, because it is a skill. The progressives are like, we never really took good care of our staff. In any election, it's like, okay, see you later. And everyone was focused on like running for Congress or something. And as opposed to just like, we need school board members, damn it. That's important too. So I think in terms of what we have to think about, I would say it was like, how we use our resources and sort of broaden our horizons of what's useful.
I had so many questions from that, but I want to stick with the resources question because that is really important. And he talks about, shepherding your treasure, like maintaining an army this way will cost you 1,000 silver, whatever, pieces a day. I love the specificity of it. I think about it, you write about it in terms of, as a progressive organization or in the movement, one of your most precious resources is the activists that you need to be willing to do X, Y, or Z. That's a resource that takes really thoughtful management in order to not just keep them engaged and energized, but to be able to continually expand that group and have them get more and more enthusiastic. And that's a really hard thing to do, I think, right now when it's just 100 outrages an hour pace that we're at. And there are so many things to be outraged about. In a way, that in itself, I don't know to what extent that's part of the Trump strategy as much as we've got this frickin' 900-page manual list of things we want to get done, and we're going to get as many done as we possibly can. The effect certainly is to divide attention and to fracture sort of where power and mobilization can happen. What does Sun Tzu have to say about how do you manage a resource and shepherd a resource in those kinds of conditions?
When to fight and when not to fight. It was always very much a priority on what can you do to not fight, because those resources are like important, and you don't want to just go spending them. Like it says in the book, no country has ever benefited from protracted warfare, right? Yeah. I mean, it's a very prescient kind of thing. So in terms of, the first thing is like, these resources are important. And for our case, for progressives, like people and their commitment and their hopes for the future and their literal hours of the week they are available and what they can do. And you really have to sort of pick your fights carefully. I think one of the things that Sun Tzu, his legend is, although there's all sorts of, nobody knows definitively who he was, when he was, but the legend is, he worked for a warlord that had vastly smaller armies than the person he was opposing. And so his strategy was to go after the larger force by trying to get it to break into smaller sections, get him to scatter. And then so that way he would have enough to take care of this one part and then take care of that other part, take care of that other part. But you have to, but if you would just go headlong with all your resources all at once in one place, well, that would be it, game over. So, I do think we have to sort of think about how we employ people and what we tell them. I do think it's like all this sort of like, protesting like no kings and whatnot. It's good to get people out, but I don't know what it does. Because look, people like, oh, look at all these people that came out in Idaho or something. Well, they have college towns in Idaho, right? Montana, Missoula, college towns. Even in the deepest red congressional district, you have like 20% Democrats. Democrats, so you could round them all up. There's these activists, and it's good they come out, but it's really not necessarily the best use for them. And it's really not changing anything. I'm concerned about, oh, we have all this. Well, it's like, that $4 gets you a latte. It's important to get people out, but don't think that, just getting out in your neighborhood and holding up signs and getting people to honk is going to change anything. That's your entry level. That's
right.
Just like getting in.
I looked at that slightly differently, and I was thinking about No Kings, which I thought had value in encouraging people who don't like what's going on to feel not so alone. And that was one of the pieces that I thought was really valuable, at how widespread and basically in almost every city there was something going on. To me, that was related to sort of morale among the opposition. You talk about the dangers of over-accommodation, the urge to make sure everybody's happy before acting, the challenge of how do you keep a coalition strong without letting them get paralyzed. I was thinking about that also in the context of something Maurice Mitchell and I think others have probably spoken about, which is we need to expand our tent and relax some of the sort of moral purity litmus tests that we have so that we can gather allies. And we may not align on everything, but look, if we're 95% aligned, we still need to be inclusive because we have to bind together around our commonalities and not get hung up on the fact that there isn't absolute purity. Because the group of people who have complete ideological alignment on everything is going to be real small. And those strike me as tensions, two different tensions, but kind of related in terms of trying to be inclusive and also tensioning against being exclusive. How do you think about managing that in these times?
What I would say is that for progressives, I do think that too often we see compromise as some sort of moral weakness as opposed to sort of a matter of faith. I think personally, if you're sort of walking in the general direction, I think we're all going to wind up in the same place sooner or later. I don't know, maybe that's a leap I can make because, I don't know, people would say I'm like a straight white guy. So of course you can think that. But I do think that if you are sort of committed to sort of going in some progressive way, some of the stuff over time, people are going to converge. I mean, people get sort of stuck in the moment, but they also don't think about things being teachable moments. I do think, like, if you look at the evolution of, let's say, how, gay lesbian rights developed, a lot of that was, sort of teachable moments. I think that we expect everyone to be with us right now or not. We can't talk to you. And I think of it as sort of, if they're engaging, we're all going in the same direction. We'll all wind up at the same place. It's just not going to happen overnight. And we have to recognize that people are just coming in from different locations. So maybe it's more of a religious view of it, I think I have sometimes, because what else do you have? I mean, if you're really going to think you can change the world for better, that's a faith, because there's no tangible evidence that that's going to happen. So that's how I see it. It's like, okay, you're willing to come along? Okay. I don't know. I'm a Quaker, convinced Quaker, came to it later in life. But, one of the principles is like, be a pattern, be an example for others. And you don't have to sort of, say everything you're going to do. Just be who you are. And if you're, living a just life, if you're being fair and honest and upright, that is the lesson to everybody around you. So that's why, I can think, okay, yeah, you're not going to be right there, but you're willing to hang out. So we're going the same way.
I really like that. Are progressives adapting? Are we learning? Are we getting any better at reading the battlefield and responding?
I don't know. I mean, I think, despair could drive some thinking. I think, so much of everything that was in the playbook obviously didn't work. So there could be some reflection, but there's a certain portion of the progressive community that's kind of like lazy, as opposed to people who are really active in the civil rights movement. I mean, they got it. They knew what they had to do and they did it. And it wasn't going to be pretty, but they did it. And they didn't expect somebody to be swooping in. They got to the bridge, they walked here, they got on the bus, they were in the lunch counters, they did it. Sometimes I think progressives overly romanticize it all, but it was a grind, right? It was doing things you didn't want to do. I think progressives are like, oh, well, if the people of color are going to vote, and they're going to vote against Trump, which is somewhat racist, assuming all Latino voters are going to vote against Trump. Well, it's like, well, there's no such thing as a Latino voter.
Right.
Cuban, Central America, actually Mexican, somebody from South America. Well, South America, Chile versus Venezuela. I mean, it's complicated, and we just kind of assume that. But we're always looking for, Trump, they passed that, they're going to be cutting Medicaid, Medicare, that's going to be what did Carvel say, an extinction level event.
It does seem as though the right is much more adept to long-term planning and power building than the left is. I don't know how important it is to try to figure out why that is compared to like just change it, but I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that.
There was polling done way back for the 2016 election, back in the Republican primary where there was like all sorts of people running in South Carolina. And there was a pollster did research and he came up with the only statistically significant predictor of what Republican would vote for Trump versus anybody else. The only one. It wasn't race, it wasn't like income. The only predictive variable was authoritarian personality. And they do that with a quick screen, like 2 questions, basically. How do you feel like should children like be creative or obey their parents? I mean, it's a little more subtle than that. It's a good question though, because it doesn't really sound like what you're looking for. So people just answer it. And yeah, that was it. That was the only thing that mattered, that could predict. So I do think there's 2 things that favor the right. One is I think they're just more naturally sort of get in line kind of folks. I also think they're more reactive and more like concerned, more fearful, I think, sometimes. You don't have to get complicated to talk to people from a Republican side, from the right side. You're just like, everyone's going to kill you and die. Everything's going to happen. It's like restaurant reviews are like, you are way more likely to believe a negative review of a restaurant than a positive review. You're also way more likely to believe a secondhand negative. Bob said that it was a bad restaurant, or Sally said it was a bad restaurant. It just travels more than just sort of the positive pieces of it. And then when you start putting in progressives, which is like, well, we want to do X, Y, and Z, and you haven't seen that yet, but this is how it'll turn out. The other thing, progressives think people are logical, and they're not. It's almost like you have to learn how to be more logical. People's emotions present themselves. Like, if you look at a car and it's a red car, you don't look at the car and sort of try to figure out what the visual spectrum is and what the light beams are coming. It's a red car. And people have emotions that way. And, and then they try to explain their emotions. And sometimes they can feel something. It's like that story, the woman in California who said she voted for Trump because he would fund IVF. I personally think she probably was just incredibly racist, but that's what she landed on, was the IVF. People's connections to their emotions are not what progressives think they are. I remember I had a professor once who talked about how grad school, and she was like, you're really fortunate how to learn how to do scientific method and this sort of logical inquiry, because most people don't get this. Most people don't see it. And that's true. So we tend to think, progressive, if we just explain it, then they'll be on our side. Well, you're not going to get that far.
I like to wrap with asking you, what's a piece of advice or a lesson from a mentor that you got that has really helped to shape your outlook or guide you through life?
In the book, I have that sort of section of Tom Johnson. One of my earlier gigs was I worked for Cleveland City Council members. So I was like up and around and in all those places that Johnson hung out. Johnson was a wealthy guy. He started out with not that much, but he invented, the old-fashioned fare boxes where you can see the money and then turn the lever. Tom Johnson invented that.
Oh, right? Wow.
Made a lot of money. Johnson took his money. He became mayor of Cleveland, and he did it he was mayor for 8 years, back when you had to run every 2 years, back when you had to elect your cabinet. He did all sorts of amazing things, very practical things, like public power. Built the first one, probably at the time was the largest, first major city that had that. Food deserts in these certain areas. He built markets, West Side Market, East Side Market, so that you can get fresh food to where poor people are. Bathhouses the same way, back before everywhere in Cleveland had plumbing. Okay, we're going to build a bath, so you can get a bath. All these really sort of very concrete things that he did because he had a very practical notion of politics. I mean, I think progressive at its core is evidence-based, right? As opposed to sort of this cronyism here or that. Like, what do people need? Where do you need to go? Granted, progressives had problems with eugenics sometimes. We don't talk about that. But generally speaking, for someone like Johnson, it's like, I'm going to run a government that does things that I know provide good for people, and I can kind of measure it and I can kind of quantify it. So when I look back at sort of like things that were important to me, it's just sort of an odd thing, but because I could walk through the city and I could see what he did. So I mean, it was an important thing that's always in the back of my mind, that you can actually get elected, and this is some really concrete, practical things you can do. And he had an advantage because he knew how the system worked, right? Trump, on one hand, could have been an interesting president if he wasn't nuts, because he did have sort of an understanding of wealth. And, if he was a different person, he might have been, I know how to do that. And he probably could have worked it in an entirely different way. Unfortunately for everybody, he's kind of nuts. But I do think that. And just also, I think, people I came up with, like Mayor Ed Boyle, North Homestead, early on in my life. Mayor of a little town outside of Cleveland, like 35,000 people. We were the first city, I drafted it working with Unite Union. We drafted legislation that prohibited the city from purchasing sweatshop products. First in the nation. There's like probably 40 or 50 cities that did it. I mean, I presented at the U.S. Conference of Mayors on that. It got a lot of room. And it was just like a little city. And that legislation is sitting in the Smithsonian. They actually requested a certified copy of that thing when they were doing an exhibit on sweatshops.
Oh, that's great.
And we did the same sort of thing with fair housing. We had the first fair housing ordinance, I think, in Calgary County that protected sexual orientation. So, I mean, those are the kind of things I learned. I really sort of think about what practically that we can do to make people's lives better today. And then you can sort of build out from that. I'm very retail politics in some ways. And it's like, I think the big picture will take care of itself if you work the ground right. Which is what the Republicans have done forever. I mean, they elect everyone to these local offices and take over state legislatures so they can set the gerrymanders, blah, 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 blah. They do that work and build it out. And so this is what we need to do.
Thank you so much for taking the time to talk. I really appreciate it. This has been great.
Oh, well, thank you.
I really enjoyed the book. Where can people get the book, by the way, and where can people tune into you?
The book is on Amazon, so that's probably the best place to find it. I do have a Substack called Progressive Conjecture, which tries to do the kind of things I talk about. It's like take something and try to find some other way to think about it. Because, as I said, I mean, if you don't fully examine things, if you don't question things, if you don't make something prove itself, you're doomed to failure. So I try to write up things that are like, sometimes quirky or odd, but at least something that someone hasn't thought about.
Thanks for tuning into the Campaign Strategist, where we dive into the art and science of advocacy. The podcast is produced by Prismatic Strategies to share wisdom and insights from leaders in the field. I'm your host, Pete Altman. Music was written by Andrea Perry and Pete Altman, and this is edited by Abby Altman. If you enjoyed today's episode, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with others who care about making a difference. You can find us wherever you get your podcast. Thanks again, and see you next time.